Welcome everybody to the Rolla Public Library, and join us for our interview with Annette Whipple, the author of the Laura Ingalls Wilder Companion. Annette Whipple is a children's book author based in Pennsylvania. She has written a wide range of books for young readers, including Woof, The Truth About Dogs, Who Knew, The Truth About Owls, The Story of the Wright Brothers, and the book we will be discussing today, titled The Laura Ingalls Wilder Companion, a chapter-by-chapter guide, which was published in 2020 by Chicago Review Press. Today, we're honored to feature her in our ongoing series of interviews with top-notch authors who have written about topics or people relevant to Missouri's colorful and interesting heritage. Annette, welcome aboard.
Thank you so much, Derek. I'm glad to be here today.
So I'm wondering if you can just give us a bit of context. When were the Little House stories written, and what inspired Laura Ingalls Wilder to write them?
So the Laura Ingalls Wilder began writing them about 1930 with, the manuscript that we know today as Pioneer Girl, and today we know it as her autobiography. And then she changed that to, pulled out some of the stories and began writing Little House in the Big Woods, because it was it was by the time she and her daughter Rose sought publication, it was the Depression, and that kind of a story, the story of her childhood wasn't going to sell, but it became Little House in the Big Woods, and then it became the whole Little House series. So she began writing about 1930. We don't know the exact time, but Little House in the Big Woods became a book in 1932, and if I remember right, during her lifetime, these Happy Golden Years, the last book that was published during her lifetime, I think that was published in 1943. And then the first 4 years, she never sought publication for that. She never edited it. And so that didn't become a book until after her death. And that was, and so that became a book in 1971. So she spent, almost 15 years writing this series. And really, it seems like from letters between her and her daughter Rose, and when we know that they were submitted to the editors, she was pretty much writing them continuously during that time period. I think that's really interesting, because it's not easy to keep going when it comes to writing sometimes.
That's for sure. Now, as an author, when did you first discover the Little House books?
Well, I discovered them as a child, in the way back of the library where the W's were. And I don't know how many of the Little House books I had read when I realized that I was reading about the author's childhood. But I do remember that I was surprised, because I thought they were, solely a work of fiction, and they are fictionalized. But so I was a little girl in my school library and reading the books as a fan. And I don't even know if I read the books in order. It's just one of those things where I know that I read them with the library. I didn't have my own set, but I really thoroughly enjoyed them. And then as an adult, I revisited them, both reading personally just for my own pleasure, as well as a classroom teacher. At one time, I was a classroom teacher. And then reading them with my own children too. And I was amazed as an adult reading just how personal they were, how much history I could understand as an adult who had, I understood American history much better than when I was, 8 or 10 years old. So just I appreciated them in a new way, and I did share them with my students. I did share them with my own children, and we needed to have a lot of conversations. And there were there were times when it's like I'm reading this aloud, and I need to stop, and I had to talk about what was happening, or my kids or the students had big questions. So there's a lot of discussion even before the Laura Ingalls Wilder Companion was an idea in my head. So just lots of discussion, lots of questions, and lots of things to think about related to history. So because even though we have lots of farms around us where I live, farming is not a way of life now for my family, and for when I was teaching for many of my students' families. And I would say most of the families that I worked with were not farmers. So it's a whole different way of life. And pioneer living, it's different. It was a long time ago. So there's just lots to discuss, lots to understand.
And in understanding that, the context that seems to be central, did your role as a teacher kind of help you to, hey, we can look at these books in context, kind of a thing? Was that role of teacher helpful in helping you understand those books?
I'm going to say yes, but I never actually planned it that way. It's kind of who I am. When I'm reading something, I look for, I'm a curious person. I often want to know more about something, and then I get excited about what I'm learning about, and I want to share it with others. So that's just kind of how I operate. And so that is the teacher in me, though. It really is. So it all kind of plays together.
When did you first start developing the concept of this book? It's a really interactive book. It has activities. It has a little pieces of trivia, and then it just has nice summaries and good critical thinking questions. So you get a well-rounded interactive book. And I'm wondering, how did you get upon the concept of this book?
Okay, so I actually know it was August of 2014 because at that point I had been blogging for many years. I had already taken some writing classes, but I was writing blog posts. I was writing magazine articles for adults. And I was reading the Chronicles of Narnia with my own family. And we had a companion guide. It was called Roar, and by Heather and David Kopp, if I remember right. And we were reading it, and my kids loved it. And they were little. 2014, my oldest was almost 8. So they were little, but we were reading aloud. But this companion guide helped us to understand the Chronicles of Narnia better. It helped us to dive deep, and we made Turkish delight based on one of the recipes in the book. And it was just it was a really neat way to explore the world of Narnia in a different way and to dive deeper. And I thought, I would love to write a book like this. And it didn't take me long to realize what books I would want to write about. So that's how it came about. But even before that, a year or two before I had the book idea, when my oldest daughter turned 6, she had a little house birthday. And so I thought, what could we do for activities at the birthday party? So, we harvested from the garden. I put, root vegetables and such in the flower bed. I didn't have a vegetable garden, so I just used the flower bed. And the children used buckets or aprons to collect the garden vegetables. And we sat on stumps for story time, and they hopped over the stumps, and we listened to Pa's fiddle during the party and danced to that. And we had apple pie, and we didn't have salt pork, but we had ham and cheese. So I was already kind of appreciating the world of Laura Ingalls Wilder, and I had already read before her biography was published. I had read a copy of that manuscript. So, and I had read some biographies about her. So I was already a big fan of Laura Ingalls Wilder, but I had not yet researched, and I wasn't diving deep into taking personal notes for a future project. I was just a big fan at that point, but it all came together nicely.
Now, when people check out this book from the library, maybe from the Rolla Public Library, maybe from your local library, wherever people are tuning in, or when they purchase the book for their own shelf, they're going to find that there's over 70 activities in here. And so they're called the Live Like Laura activities, which is an awesome idea. And I'm wondering, where did you get the ideas for some of these activities? Because there's a wide range of them.
Mm-hmm. The ideas came directly from the pages of the Little House books. Once I had the idea to write this book, I knew I didn't want it to just be biography. I knew I didn't just want it to be history. I wanted it to be an interactive, hands-on way for children, especially, to experience pioneer life and to live like Laura, to live like Almanzo. And so for every book in the Little House series, I created pages and pages of charts that went chapter by chapter, and I took notes. This is what the plot was. These are some ideas that I might want to explore further and research. These are some vocabulary words that kids might not know these days. And these are some of the activities that Laura, Mary, Carrie, Grace, Almanzo, and these are the activities that we might do. And I wanted to make sure it wasn't just a recipe book. And I also didn't want it to just be like like sewing, and that I didn't want it to be that. I wanted it to be a book really for the modern day kid, boy or girl. And I wanted it to include the food. I wanted it to include activities as well as crafts. And I was able to do that.
What is your favorite activity?
Alice's Air Castle was a lot of fun to make. And I just, instead of using, straw, like the hay straw, the plant, we used plastic straws because I wanted to use things that were easy for kids to find today. And I made Alice's Air Castle. That was one of my favorites. I had a lot of fun, and it was a challenge too, making the braided rag rug. And I didn't even try to make a rag rug. I made a trivet about this size, so that, like a hot pad. But the braiding was a lot of fun, but sewing it together, I could not believe how long it took. And for my little trivet like this, I probably had 20 or 30 feet, at least 20 for sure, of the braid before I could sew it together. I was surprised at how small it really was, and just how much time and fabric. And I used old T-shirts. So, I just like the pioneers would use old sheets, old rags to do such a thing. I wanted to repurpose some of my old fabric in as old shirts. So that was another one. My favorite foods, the self-turning donuts were probably my favorite. The soda crackers were the big surprise. And vinegar pie was also, the vinegar pie was a nice surprise. It was surprisingly sweet. The soda crackers, I was expecting something like a saltine, and it may have had the savory flavor of a saltine, but it was soft. So it was almost like flatbread, and it was incredible. My kids' favorite was probably the maple snow candy. So every winter, except the winter when my son had braces, every winter we've made that because it's sticky stuff, but it's good. So if we once we have a couple inches of snow, it's time to make that maple snow candy.
Awesome.
So yeah, I love those activities. And
you're mentioning too, so your kids have favorite activities. You worked on these things with your kids. And I'm wondering, what do you believe the value of family and friends working on activities like this is?
Well, when it comes to the idea of either an activity inspired by a book or inspired by history, I think and here we have both. I think it brings those conversations, it makes those conversations more personal, and it kind of makes everything, it helps us to connect to one another a little bit more as, just like a book club. That discussion helps you to better understand one another, but doing something together helps you to understand one another as well as whatever that topic might be a little bit better.
What do you believe the value is for modern readers to interact with these older stories about this pioneer experience in America?
I think we can learn so much from books, both books written today, but especially when they're personal accounts. And, Laura Ingalls Wilder, she fictionalized her childhood and her teenage years in the Little House books. But they're based on real experience. And I actually really appreciate how she didn't sugarcoat some of those complicated issues, like with the Native Americans. She told it like it was, and she could have changed her neighbor's perspective, or she could have changed her Ma's attitude toward the American Indians, but she didn't. And there are, and today we look at it through a very different lens, but it's still one family's perspective. But I think what we can do to make sure that we remember that, learning about the pioneers through the Little House books, it's one perspective. And so can we read other books? Can we go to, can we visit museums? Can we visit other museums? Can we, read the Birch Bark House and some other things like that, where it's one experience, but and I value it. And I think a lot of people do, but we just need to remember one perspective. And there are many. In any situation, there's going to be a lot of perspectives. So
I know as somebody who studied history, that's one of the things you're taught is you balance a historical narrative with several different perspectives. And if you focus too much on one or too much on another, or if you just dismiss one because of something that you don't like about it from today's perspective, you can sometimes skew things,
Yes. And from my research, I do think that Laura Ingalls Wilder she tried to be sensitive to other people and the Native Americans. And we look at it today through a very different lens than when she was writing. And, it's important to remember that.
Absolutely. Now, throughout your book, you tackle kind of the blurred lines between fact and fiction. Mm-hmm. With these narratives that are in the Little House the Little House books. What is the significant challenges and distinct? These books were written; they're obviously dramatized. It's not like she's saying, "Oh, these," they're dramatized works. What is the challenge between separating kind of the fact from the fiction? And throughout the book, you include several sections that attempt to do this, and I'm wondering, mm-hmm. What are some of the challenges between distinguishing, the reality from the drama?
Yeah. So what Derek's referring to, I include a lot of these fact or fiction sidebars within the book, and it's throughout my entire book in each of the chapters. I think the first thing is my own assumptions. I mean, when I was reading The Long Winter, I assumed that she was exaggerating those blizzards, and because even though I grew up with real winters, snow on the ground most of the year, and sometimes 4 or 5 feet, but not very often, I assumed that she was exaggerating those winters. And the research shows that she actually remembered, all those years later, she actually remembered the timing of the storms and the severity of the storms really well. And though we don't have weather reports for the Smith, we do have weather reports for nearby areas. And so that surprised me. So I think we just need to really remember our own assumptions. And, as I was trying to kind of pull out different things that I wanted to investigate, did this really happen? Like, was Mother Wilder's dress really wider than the doorway? Just some things that, maybe we have questions, did that really happen that way? And so it's, some things, yes, this is really true. And other things, no, it's not. Nellie Olson, yes, she is a strong character throughout those Little House books and even in the TV show. But was she a real person? And well, Nellie Olson wasn't, but she was the composite character of 3 different people in Laura's childhood. And so I included things like that. And then there are other things that it's just hard to know when we're reading. And even when we're reading something like a newspaper article from the 1800s or early 1900s, or, at whatever time period, just because we think of news as being nothing but the facts, it hasn't always been that way. So we have to really examine our sources carefully. So choosing that, writing about the fact or fiction of the Little House books was one of my favorite parts of it.
Very good. Did you just, you kind of addressed this, but to kind of go into an interesting direction that you opened up, does exploring books like the Little House books, older books, history in general, does that kind of help you to learn what your assumptions are?
I think it can if we let it. I also think that interacting with others, do we want to think more deeply about what we're reading? We can choose to, or we can just kind of read it and go on to the next book. So I think when it comes to history, when it comes to fiction, nonfiction that we're reading, how we respond to it will determine how we let it affect us and how we think about those situations that we're reading about or watching or talking about.
Now, that kind of leads into a good next question I have, which is your house talk sections. And basically those sections in your book are encouraging people to ask critical questions of the Little House books. Why do you think it's important for young people, especially, to think critically about texts such as the Little House books?
Well, and quite honestly, I think we need to examine everything that we read, and including, if you're reading my book, examine it closely for truth. And, it doesn't matter what I'm writing, and I want to convey truth, fiction or nonfiction. I really, professionally, I write just nonfiction. But that's my desire. But maybe, I have my own worldview, and any writer is going to bring their own perspective to a story. So we do need to think deeply, in my opinion, not just about history and not just about what we're reading, but like, what was the motive of this person, whether it's a real life person or a fictional character? And because, just because they seem like the bad guy, did they have their own side of the story? They probably did. Even if that side isn't shown in the story, there is often a little bit more to that. So, we can think about other people more than ourselves, and all of this kind of happens when we let it, when we do think deeply and critically about a book, about a character, about, our friend at school. So and ourselves, of course.
Do you think that thinking critically about books like the Little House books helped you to think critically more just in general life?
I do. And there were things that, even there are things that are just touched on in the Little House books that when I was in history class in school, both elementary, high school, college, I understand some things very differently now, and it wasn't necessarily taught to me, but it was because I wanted to understand more, like how the Transcontinental Railroad affected other people. That whether it would be the Asian immigrants who were working it, the Native Americans who were living out there already, as well as the white pioneers. There's a lot to think about when we choose to.
Going back just generally through the whole series, what are some of the most significant discoveries you made as you went and did this research into the history and into the books themselves?
So I think my personal biggest discovery was coming up with the conclusion that now when I was researching, the book Prairie Fires by Carolyn Fraser hadn't been written yet. But as far as I know, that was the first book that stated that Almanza Wilder was likely born in 1859 instead of 1857. But when I was researching, all the books had said he was born in 1857. That's what his headstone says. That was just what he had always said. And it goes back to that whole Homestead Act and needing to be a certain age to be a homesteader. But the census records that I saw said that he was, 1 year old in 1860. And then there were 3 census records in a row that showed that he was likely born in 1859. And so this just really blew my mind. And so I began talking to some other experts. And quite honestly, I have not spent my whole lifetime researching Laura Ingalls Wilder and the Little House books. There are others who have. And so I consider them to be the experts. And so I consulted with them. And they agreed that this was questionable and it was likely that he was born in 1859. But because I didn't just take what every other book had said at face value, and I kind of dove a little bit deeper and looked into that more, I was shocked. So I did include what I call a sidebar in one of the chapters about, when was he really born? And I explain the discrepancies, and can we know with 100% certainty? Maybe not, but I think it's really, really, really likely that he was born in 1859, and others are agreeing with me too. So, but that was probably my biggest surprise.
Interesting. So as parents and families that are reading this book, just in general, what advice would you give to parents who want to talk about the complexity of the pioneer experience? You talked about the perspective and considering assumptions, but what specifically would you tell a parent who has some kids and they're looking to engage in interesting and constructive conversations about surrounding the Little House books?
I think it's important to understand the bigger context, the history, and so that's one of the reasons why I did dive so much into parts of American history, as well as the real people in the Little House books. So understanding that bigger context, and not just looking at the white man's perspective. And the pioneers were white men, and yes, there were all sorts of immigrants who were pioneers, but they were typically white people. And so I think understanding that larger perspective is going to help us. And as I mentioned, reading other books. If you want to read the Little House books, and if they're on your if they are on your bookshelf, maybe the Birch Bark House should be on your bookshelf, as well as Prairie Lotus as well. 2 other books that are for readers of the same age and kind of explore from a different side. So those are just some simple things to think about. But have conversations, and as much as I tried to make this book a conversation, real conversations are going to be so much more important than just a book. So
one of the things I love about your book actually is that it can lead to those conversations. It's like a starting off place depending on how you use it.
Yes. And though the children are my the audience I had in mind as I was writing, I knew that parents would want to, parents, whether homeschoolers or just parents who like to read aloud to their kids, as well as teachers, once they knew of it, they could use it as that resource to interact with the Little House books. And that was my hope. Not just for the young reader, but for families and classrooms as well.
So Annette, what other books have you written, and why do you enjoy writing for young readers?
Well, I think facts are fun, and I think this world is amazing, and the people are in it are equally as amazing, and we can learn so much from the people, from this world. So I write informational books for kids. In addition to the Laura Ingalls Wilder Companion, lots of history, lots of people and activities. I've also written the story of the Wright brothers, the two high-flying brothers who invented and built the first airplane. But I also love science. So I have, these are some of my books. We have Who Knew? The Truth About Owls. And this is a question and answer book. You can see, can owls spin their heads around? Lots of images, and as well as some humorous sidebars. And in that same series is Woof, the Truth About Dogs. And the very newest one is Scurry, the Truth About Spiders. And I really love how, we know that not everyone is comfortable with spiders. However, I really feel like the images in this book are quite inviting, and even the cover is more inviting than scary. And I really appreciate that. So that's my newest book. And then there will be 2 more in that series coming out next year: Ribbit, the Truth About Frogs, and Meow, the Truth About Cats. So yes, I think facts are fun. I want to celebrate curiosity, not just my own, but help, make kids wonder. So I write about this world and the people in it.
And where can people learn more about you, what you do, the books you write, and connect with you online?
So for those who are most interested in Laura Ingalls Wilder, you could visit wildercompanion.com. And I don't update that blog too frequently, but I do update it a bit. And then AnnetteWhipple.com is my author site, and I include lots of resources for writers and for teachers there. And I also have my schedule of events, including my trip to Missouri that's upcoming at the beginning of November for the Laura Ingalls Wilder Children's Literature Festival that will be held in Mansfield this year. And then I'm on social media on Facebook and Instagram, Annette Whipple Books, on Twitter at Annette Whipple. And I'm also on Facebook. I also have the Laura Ingalls Wilder Companion. So I'm around. You can find me.
Wonderful. And just to close up, do you have any encouragement to give to young readers or to parents who are wanting to encourage their kids to read?
Yeah, and I was not a reader when I was young. I was one of the late readers in my class. But once I was there, it was good. But and as a parent, I can also say, just keep going. And I borrow when my son especially wasn't so interested in reading, I would borrow, stacks of books at a time, and we still borrow like 40 books from the library at a time. We're readers. But I would just grab books that might interest him in a variety of topics, fiction and nonfiction, and just keep trying. And when my kids were really little, if they didn't want to sit in my lap for a story, I didn't worry about it. They might be playing nearby while I was reading. They were still listening to stories. And audiobooks are also a parent's friend. It's a great way to, listen to a longer story, even when the kids are little, because they're especially in a car, their attention can be, out the window, but with an ear to a story. And for young writers and readers, I'd say just keep doing it. talk to others and see if you want to be a writer. Make sure you keep writing. You don't necessarily have to write every day, but keep at it. And then, revisions are really important, to go back and make changes to make your story even better. And sometimes talking to a friend or to an adult about how you could even improve your story a little bit is going to be helpful. I work with critique partners myself because I'm a better writer in community. So I work with other writers to help me be a better writer. And it's worked out well.
You can always learn so much from people when you open up and engage, right?
Absolutely.
Well, Annette, is there anything that you would like to add to our conversation today?
I think we've talked a lot, and I'm just so glad to have been able to talk to the folks at the Rural Library. So I'm glad you had me here, Derek. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Annette.